Chapter 26 of Lost Empires. Aemond. Sir Lenor grinned, holding his wooden training sword at Aemond's neck with one hand, while drying sweat off his brow with the other, as a sparse applause sounded from the few spectators. "Better luck next time, Aemond," he said, made smug by his victory. Irritated by his loss, Aemond reached up to push away the waster hovering at his neck. Sir Lenor had declined using real steel for the spar in favor of wooden wasters. Without steel, one could push harder, not be as mindful in case one accidentally cut the other, though getting stabbed with a plank of wood could do enough damage too. Aemond had once seen a guard named Lester try to duck the swing of a waster during a heated practice, but a slight miscalculation saw it smashing into his head instead. He died. Now he was recalled as the late Sir Lester of the Waster, his memory living on as a cautionary tale for fresh recruits of the garrison. Aemond walked over to Sir Crispin's squire, Adrian Tarbeck, and accepted the cloth the man held out to wipe his face. Whilst drying off the signs of exhaustion, Aemond glanced up at the walkway where a few ladies had huddled up in coats to watch the practice. Maris and Aline Baratheon, as well as Jacqueline Redwine, were there, and brightened up when they saw him looking in their direction. A simple nod and smile made Jacqueline beam, and little Aline Baratheon wave eagerly. Ariel wasn't there, which might have been for the better. He'd hardly want her watching his defeat, though it still nagged at him. Dragonstone, Winterfell, travelling. Somehow it had been easier to get a moment of her time anywhere except the Red Keep, where it had become nigh on impossible. I can't wait till spring returns, Sir Lenor said, accepting a cloth from Adrian too. Far easier to practice without freezing my balls off, and we can hold tourneys again. The mealies are always fun. And how's your jousting, Aemond? Think you'll be ready to participate? Will I be facing you on the lists? Why would I mum and battle at a playhouse for the entertainment of the spectators? Aemond responded. Sir Lenor patted him on the shoulder, his hand lingering. It's not true battle, but an adequate placeholder. In war, we're on Dragonback, where you won't get closer than a distance of Vermivor's flamethrower. It's really only during tourneys you get to compare your skills against the other knights of the kingdom. Aemond hesitated, taking a second to consider. I measure myself against the Kingsguard. They're already the most skilled knights in the kingdom. No, they're the most acclaimed knights in the kingdom, Sir Lenor corrected. Doesn't mean there aren't other excellent swordsmen to try yourself against too. Hundreds of them. And even so, the best knight in all the realm may yet be felled by an arrow aimed by a cornered greenboy, just as the dragon Meraxes was killed during the conquest by a single bolt to the eye aimed by a craven Dornishman. You'd know if you'd ever seen the disarray of real battle. Nothing gets a man more riled up than the threat of death. Even an untrained beggar becomes absolutely frenzied. Imagine what a trained knight can do. And yet a tourney is not the place such happens, Aemond retorted dryly. Its purpose is to please the masses. Lighten up, Aemond, Sir Lenor insisted, still holding his shoulder. You already spent half your time in the practice yards. Why not do the same to a standing ovation? Annoyed, Aemond shook off Sir Lenor's grip and stepped back. He respected Sir Lenor as a fellow unburned, his pure Valyrian heritage, dragon riding, and skills with a blade. But Aemond had no inclination to be linked with the rumours circulating his preferences. Sir Lenor was already known for going after young squires. I'll be in attendance, so I may be entertained by the spectacle as usual, and watch you be unhorsed by the Kingsguard, as usual. Sir Lenor scowled. Now that they were both annoyed, perhaps the next spar would be harder. Again? Aemond challenged, holding up his blade. It's too cold. And you're not training hard enough to keep warm. This is summer compared to the north. I already won, Aemond, he said dryly. Then why don't you prove your win wasn't a fortunate coincidence? A bolt to the eye, as you say, Aemond taunted, twirling his waster sword. Sir Lenor headed back into the ring. Don't push it, green boy. You've yet to claim victory against me. Aemond smirked. It's not as if they saw one another enough to spar frequently, but even so he remembered their first fight vividly. He'd been a useless little lad of 10, Lenor a man grown and blooded warrior. It was the only true battle Aemond had been in, if one could call a beating such, and yet not a single one of Lenor's punches had been as lethal as Vhagar's fire, which Heriel had neutralized with a raised hand. Yet, would a bolt to the eye take down Heriel the way it had Meraxes? From the way she talked sometimes, he thought it likely. Heriel's magic seemed to only be able to stop what she saw coming, what she had time to react to, and as inhuman as her magic was, her physical reflexes were only those of a woman. Aemond pushed the disturbing thought away, refocusing on Lenor. Now Rubius, that was another matter. Magic and inhuman strength. If Rubius had cared for the Song of Swords or the Call of Battle, no warrior in the realm would have been able to compare. Boros Baratheon tried to cover his fascination, but despite Rubius' glaring lack of courtly graces, the Stormlander was nearly in awe of the man after the statue incident. The narrow passages of the Red Keep had caused Rubius to accidentally tip over a stone statue. Fortunately, he had caught it with one hand before it smashed to the floor, and put it back in place as if it was no heavier than a mop. Normally, not a single man in the castle could even budge that statue without assistance. They had just gotten into position when Sir Eric came jogging into the courtyard. The Kingsguard wasn't on watch, so for once Eric wasn't wearing his white cloak and armor. Sir Lenor, I came to inform you Princess Rhaenyra began her labors, sir. Aemond's sword arm lowered, tension tightening in his shoulders. Round as a barrel, Aemond's half-sister had arrived days earlier by ship along with her children and household, while Sir Lenor returned the following morning on his dragon Sea Smoke, though now Rhaenyra was having her 5th babe in the Red Keep. What if it was a boy? She has! Thank you, Sir Eric. If it is only just started, it'll probably be a while still, Aemond remarked, the itch for a proper rematch only intensified. It will, Lenor nodded. Make sure a midwife tells my dear wife I'm praying for a safe delivery for her and the babe. I'll see her after the birth. Sir Eric left to relay the message while Sir Lenor got back into position. Heriel. Do you wish to continue, Your Grace? Heriel asked awkwardly, reaching up to adjust her glasses. She'd been in the middle of reading her divination book when Rhaenyra's labors started. There had been a dwindling number of participants for these reading sessions, so there hadn't been many to begin with. But between Rhaenyra's water breaking, the Grand Maester assisting the princess, the Queen giving brisk orders and sending the servants scurrying to comply, Heriel had somehow ended up almost alone in the Solar with the King. The only other person left was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Harold Westerling. What? The King exclaimed, as if he'd quite forgotten Heriel was there. Seated on a chair squeezed in the narrow space between the window and his giant model of old Valyria, Heriel held up her copy of Unfogging the Future. Do you wish to hear more, or do you want me to leave, Your Grace? Viserys shook his head. No, that's fine, Lady Heriel. With Rhaenyra starting her labors, I will need something far more distracting than shape interpretation of tea leaves to keep my mind occupied. The princess is strong, Your Grace. Heriel tried to sound confident and optimistic, because Viserys was obviously worried for his daughter. She's delivered 4 healthy, thriving babes before, and recovered from each one. Viserys nodded. I know, but her mother died in childbed, and not her first childbed either. Since she wouldn't be reading anymore, Heriel took off her glasses and pocketed them. Can I be of assistance, Your Grace? Even if this isn't distracting enough. She held up her book to indicate what she meant. I know some magic that might entertain you. Viserys tilted his head. Oh so. Heriel looked around for inspiration, her gaze landing on a stone model at her side. Such as this. Heriel drew out her wand. Colavaria. With a soft flash, the ground around the painstakingly carved buildings turned into green in an imitation of grass, and the stairs into grey stone, bringing the model a step closer to life. Let me assure you this is harmless to the model, but do you want me to remove it, Your Grace? She asked. Or to continue? The king lit up with an excitement that suddenly made him look a little bit like Daemon. Keep going, Lady Heriel. With Viserys' assistance on how things should look, by the time Ariel was finished the entire landscape was filled out with grass, flowers and even a little river stream. There was light inside the colored buildings and the little dragon figurines on the roof was standing on its hind legs flapping its wings. To say it worked as a distraction would be an understatement. Even after Ariel was done charming and transfiguring the model, the king kept chatting happily for over an hour about the text he'd studied to put the model together. It reminded Ariel of the way Helena talked of bugs. Even if the subject matters were different, they talked with similar delight and reverence for their passions. "Does my model look anything like your home?" the king wondered after nearly 2 hours of gushing about his model. Ariel shook her head. "Unfortunately not, your grace. Though it is only to be expected. My home island had a very different weather than warm Valyria, and had to build accordingly. Closer to the Vale than southern Essos. Maybe parts of the structure here, such as these?" She gestured to the plainer, square blocks along the outer corner. The shape and window patterns reminded her of an apartment building. "We had tall square buildings like these, often used for housing, where people could buy a few rooms within the building to call their own. Hundreds of people could live within one of them." Viserys' brows climbed up in curiosity. "Oh? But how would that have worked?" Ariel did her best to explain. Though she was no expert in the topic, she had picked up a thing or two at the Dursleys. A wealthy lord would erect a building out of his own coffers, and then a person with less gold would buy the rights to use a certain number of rooms for their private use. They didn't buy the whole building, just the rooms they could afford. Then the lord would sell a few more rooms to someone else until all the rooms in the building were occupied. That way he earned back everything he'd spent erecting the building, usually with profit. Then he'd build another and do the same all over. "And you managed this with the aid of magic?" Viserys presumed. Ariel shook her head. "No, your grace. This was far more practiced among those without magic than those with. Those rooms were bought by perfectly regular small folk because the cities were massive. There's a few 100,000 here in King's Landing, but in London, the population was counted in the millions. Yet amongst the near 60 million people who lived across the island, there were only about a few thousand with magic like me." Viserys' eyes grew round, and the Kingsguard Herald Westerling glanced over sharply, while Ariel nodded to emphasize the point. "There were so many people, eventually became more practical to build upwards than sideways to room everyone." Ariel gestured around the model. "Magical buildings were a little like any of these. They were magical so they didn't need to be square. They didn't require to follow the low direction. The Hogwarts was a castle, the most magical place you can imagine, your grace. And some of the arches on this building here share a few elements with that castle." "Castle Hogwarts. I've seen paintings of this in Rubius' treasury." Viserys nodded. "I think you would have enjoyed visiting Hogwarts, your grace. It was not as large or grand as the Red Keep, but it was so magical. Every brick was steeped in it. The paintings not only moved but could talk too, and if I got lost they could give me directions. The staircases changed directions according to their own whims, sometimes while you were trying to climb them. The ceiling of the Great Hall was enchanted to appear like the sky outside, making it seem as if you were seated outside, though you were not." "It sounds like you miss it, Lady Ariel." The king sounded almost shrewd in his tone of voice, and Ariel stilled. This wasn't the first time she'd been asked, but she hadn't expected the question from the king. "House Targaryen has been very generous, your grace." "But not enough to have made this your home in your eyes. When you speak of your island, it reminds me of the way I dream of Valyria. It was a very different place. Your way of life has been an adjustment after my own beginnings. It's made things difficult," she admitted. "When you grew up the way I did, the way of Westeros, I've had to lower my expectations on several things, especially when it comes to the comforts of living." "Lower your expectations?" Viserys exclaimed, disbelieving. Ariel smiled apologetically. "I mean no offense, your grace, but you've seen the facilities within Hagrid's Chest, and you need to understand nearly everyone back home, not only the rich and powerful. All those millions of people of small folk had access to such within their homes too. There were more roads, faster means of traveling, magical or otherwise. I'm afraid all these years later I'm still spoiled. I still crave them back, because daily life was far more convenient. I cannot fault you, Lady Hariel. The island of Britain sounds like a paradise, Viserys said quietly. His words were so unexpected Hariel chuckled. Like this, talking of hobbies and traveling, the king was very likable. In my dreams, I sometimes think it was, but then it can't have been, since my parents were killed in a war. And then I'd recall other things which doesn't add up with a paradise. There were wars, injustice and greed there as it can be found anywhere, Your Grace. I was only a child when I last saw it, but even I felt that growing up. That no matter how much we gain, there will always be some who will attempt to get even more at the expense of others. Viserys leaned back, contemplating her for a long second. You do not sound like a young maiden, Lady Hariel. Most maidens haven't been through what I have either, Your Grace. They've remained in their homes their whole life, seen the same people, same places, learned the same things, without anyone different to compare themselves against. They start believing that is all there is, while I have seen more than me, Viserys mused. You've seen far more of both Westeros and Essos than I have. I wouldn't want to presume, but I was left with that impression too, Your Grace. You speak of these matters with Rhaenyra, Viserys wondered. Your daughter is curious to learn of magic, but somehow we haven't talked much of. Hariel gestured to the model of old Valyria. How things were. She's more focused on making sure I understand how Westeros is and learning how daily life was for me back before I came here. Which is fair, this is not my home, and I've had a lot to learn. How is this not your home? You've lived here for years. Hariel looked down at the model. As honored as I am to be a ward of your daughter, that does not change that I have no home of mine own in Westeros, that you view me as foreign, that I struggle with your tongue, that there are misunderstandings. It's hard to explain, Your Grace. Just consider this. You spent decades researching and building this model of old Valyria, which makes me think it's dear to you. Yet you are the king of Westeros, so how come you're daydreaming of a long-fallen empire, where House Targaryen was barely a step above a vassal house of stronger dragon lords? Ah, I see, Viserys said thoughtfully, coughing lightly into his hand. But just like we lost Valyria, you've lost your home too. Westeros is where you and Rubius live now, same as us. It is. England was as lost to Hariel as Valyria was to the Targaryens. They'd conquered Westeros to gain a new home, but Hariel had no inclination to follow their footsteps. Instead of conquering, she was integrating. May I speak truthfully, Your Grace? Viserys sighed. Go on. The reason I'm worried to call this home is because the more I learn, the less I can picture what my future will look like here, Hariel said, unsure if this was appropriate to bring up with the king, even if they were on the topic. But she was an outsider, and so she'd grown used to observing their lives in contrast to what she recalled of her old one. Reflection had become a necessary skill to survive. It also meant Hariel was uniquely positioned to see things from a different mindset, but it didn't require an outside perspective to realize that tension within the royal family was too strained. Perchance it's because I'm an outsider, and that makes me view things differently, Hariel said. I can support Rhaenyra as heir because I grew up with a queen who's been uncontested for decades, though maybe my home country has too many fundamental differences from Westeros for it to be a fair comparison. Such as how despite being a girl, I was allowed to become a maester in my home country, or own lands, or inherit all my parents' wealth instead of passing it to a male cousin. Your laws work against Rhaenyra, Your Grace, and I fear there are many in Westeros who's not been given the same convincing incentives to trust this can work as I have. I am the king, and my word is law. I've made it perfectly clear who my heir is, and to question it is treason, Lady Hariel. But this time your word goes against tradition and faith, Your Grace. Every other house in Westeros upholds the rights of the firstborn sons, Hariel said quickly, almost pleadingly. Whilst I was in the north, a place far removed from the capital, your daily governing barely affects them. Even some lords couldn't name the members of the royal family. I fear for Princess Rhaenyra and wish to assist her the best I can, just as I do Jace, Luke, Joffrey, Visenya and the babe would hopefully be here soon. Westeros is a large kingdom, your grace, and even if no one's told you, outside the city her claim is disputed. In truth, Hariel thought the king should have been far more proactive in strengthening Rhaenyra as his heir, starting by not naming his firstborn son Aegon of all the stupid bloody names. Rhaenyra had already been named heir. Viserys must have known how disputed such a choice would be. Yet he'd given his firstborn son the one name that was as synonymous with rulership as their surname. Every other alternative from the list of near indistinguishable Targaryen names would have been better. The second thing Hariel kept thinking was that Rhaenyra should not be living on Dragonstone. Why was she? Why not here in King's Landing? And why was Rhaenyra not the hand of the king and regent whenever her father was ill? It would have given people and the doubters a chance to see Rhaenyra act as the second most powerful person in the kingdoms, and she'd be far harder to speak against once Viserys died. We have dragons, Viserys pointed out angrily. But is that something you wish to resort to? Hariel asked fiercely. For your daughter to climb onto Dragonback and go to war to keep her inheritance, without you there to support her. Things don't always go to plan, your grace. It doesn't always solve itself. Look at the Faith Militant's reaction to Targaryen marriage practices. Look at me, your grace. Learn from my example. I am no princess, but in my home country I was revered for my history regardless. For surviving the impossible and ending a war. I am a woman. I have a dragon. I have magic. I have power. By all means, if that was all it took, how on earth did I end up here in Westeros, your grace? Barely more than a guest in someone else's kingdom. So you come here, attempting to coerce me into naming Aegon heir? No! Hariel exclaimed and smacked a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. They stared at each other for long moments, the silence only interrupted by the slight clanking from Sir Harl's armor when the Kingsguard shifted in the corner. Then what are you trying to counsel me? I'm not trying to counsel you, your grace. I'm only carrying unpleasant truths gathered from my own experiences and observations, because I hoped if I informed my king, you would have the means to rectify the situation. Hariel said quietly. To strengthen Rhaenyra's claim somehow, or Jacaerys' claimant. I did not make Rhaenyra heir on a whim, Lady Hariel, and I sure will not be bypassing her in favor of any grandchildren. Hariel shook her head. Besides the oaths you've made the Lords of Westeros swear 17 years ago, by some who's died since then, Rhaenyra's strongest claim to the throne is that her firstborn is a son. The promise that Jace will succeed Rhaenyra is her best security, but the doubters who don't want a woman as their ruling monarch will slander Jacaerys to weaken her. They already are, or there's rumors about. You know what I speak, your grace. I hear them still. They even reached me at Dragonstone, where Rhaenyra's claimant is at its strongest. So I can't help but think that the more secure Jacaerys is, the more secure Rhaenyra will be. Even if you pretend this is but mere innocent speculations, you still sound precisely like an advisor about to counsel me. And yet I'm only the bearer of someone else's words, Hariel said, wringing her hands. This was not something I thought of by myself, but I've come around to the reasoning since. Then get to the point, Lady Hariel. Jacaerys and Helaena. Hariel said the words quickly before she could chicken out. Unite the claims of your divided children. That way, both your daughters will be queens. From a child by Jace and Helaena, Westeros would gain a future king with the blood of House Targaryen, Valyrian, Arryn, Baratheon and Hightower in their veins. It's the best match either of them can make. For Hariel made sure to appear confident, on the inside she felt nauseous. This was more than simply defending herself or Hagrid. This was sinking to their level of scheming, wasn't it? What right did Ariel have to stick her nose into Helena or Chase's betrothals? None at all. Yet she couldn't waste the opportunity. Ariel had to try, and she couldn't see an alternative that didn't end in worse options. Options she didn't want to imagine. I'm afraid my wife would never agree to that. Viserys shook his head. Oh, is that so? Ariel said tightly, eyes hard. Alicent wouldn't agree. Did that mean Rhaenyra would? And what mother wouldn't wish their daughters to be queen? It's complicated, Lady Ariel. There's a long history of disagreements between Rhaenyra and Alicent. Disagreements so severe the Queen will deny House Hightower's blood from continuing down the line of succession. And the Lord Hand has not objected to this. A glint of something that might have been anxiety glinted in the king's eye, but it was gone in a blink, making Ariel wonder it was just a trick of the flickering firelight. Viserys looked down at his remaining hand, at a golden ring on his finger. I am but a foreigner, and I might have misunderstood something vital regarding the situation, but I do understand that you are the king. This is your house. Helena is your daughter. Jacaer is your grandson. You have all the rights of the lands you rule to make this happen, and for what it's worth, Princess Helena was the one who told me she wanted this, for peace and unity. Viserys coughed into his hand, and she waited until he'd regained his breath. Helena did? She never told me that. Mayhaps she would have if she'd been asked. Viserys studied the firelight for long seconds, which was frying Ariel's nerves, but it was far too late to backtrack now. She'd stepped in it and would have to try her best to see it through. She couldn't yell the truth to the king without endangering Hagrid and Norbert, but she could try to play fair games. Ironic though it was, because in a way, didn't they want the exact same thing? Rhaenyra is queen of a peaceful, stable Westeros. Viserys' line secured and united, from Lucerys to Aemond. Everyone happy. Right, and gold grew on lemon trees. You are not the first to counsel this, Viserys admitted eventually. Ariel perked up, relieved she and Helena weren't alone in this. It is in an advantageous match, Your Grace. Many years before you came to Westeros, Daemon used to be my heir, Viserys said slowly. I thought if his daughter became queen one day, then maybe we could have a chance to. He trailed off and Ariel held back a grimace. If this happened, Daemon would be pissed off. And Baela. Some deity needed to have mercy on her because Baela would kill Ariel for betraying her this way. How many hours hadn't Ariel spent listening to Baela dream of marrying Jace? Of becoming queen? Of aspiring to be like King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne? Ariel felt justified in doing this, but that didn't mean it wasn't a betrayal. That is admirable, Your Grace, Ariel said quietly, not sure what to say here. Baela would make an excellent queen too. She's as fierce as her father and as beautiful as her mother. Baela loves Jaehaerys and dreams of this, but she can't unite your legacy the way Princess Helena can, nor strengthen Rhaenyra's rule whenever that day happens. The words felt like sand on her tongue, yet she couldn't take them back or regret it. She'd never thought she'd get to speak with Viserys this way, but now that the opportunity had arisen, she had to take it, even at the expense of a friend, because this was so much bigger than Baela's feelings, than Ariel's feelings. Viserys leaned to rest his head against the back of his chair with a husky and exhausted sigh. Rhaenyra is having a baby today. I invited you to stay as a distraction from the pain my daughter is suffering, not to be fed with fear-mongering politicking. Ariel could tell she was about to be kicked out. I apologize if I overstepped, Your Grace. You have, but I will forgive it. Viserys' shoulders sagged. I cannot condemn you when it's in defense of Rhaenyra's stability of rule and safety. Aemond. Bathed and hair brushed, Aemond walked down the hallway of the Red Keep in his freshly laundered silk-embroidered doublet. The luxury almost a mocking contrast to the split lip and bruised jaw inflicted by Laenor's elbow during his second loss. Being in his mid-30s, the man was getting on in years, but remained quick on his feet. Damn it! As well as heavier and stronger. But one day, Aemond promised himself. One day soon Sir Laenor would be the one to yield. His musings were interrupted by an unpleasant moan and his gaze flickered upwards. I told you I wanted another blanket! I'm freezing! Where is it? A strained voice called from the floor above. Grimacing, Aemond glanced up at the ceiling. The Grand Maester must have put Rhaenyra to deliver in the East Wing, and from the sounds of it, right above the corridor Aemond was passing through. At least it answered whether Rhaenyra had delivered yet. If it wasn't winter, perhaps he'd have gone for a ride on horseback until the yowling was done with. He could visit Vermithor in his cave along the beach, but the new light was already past its peak. Even if he left immediately, he likely wouldn't return until long after supper. Quickening his gait, Aemond reached the end of the corridor where he could hear the murmurs of more voices. A familiar one amongst them. Coming down the narrow staircase from the upper floor, Hariel was conversing with two servants. It took him a while to realize Hariel's gown was normal that day, but only because it had taken a while to look away from her comely face. The waves embroidered on her Tudor hood were washing across the front piece like a calm ocean, whilst the veil splitting down her back appeared like sea smoke. So thin and wispy her black hair braided with a shimmering ribbon was visible underneath. Lady Hariel, he asked, catching sight of the book in her arms. Have you been reading for father again? I was. I just left the solar. And now she was alone. This might be the best chance he'd had to speak with her all week. Aemond adjusted the dragon wing brooch at his neck. Normally he preferred his levers, but the standards of attire at court had risen significantly. A fruitless endeavor. The evidence was right in front of him. Because no Lannister's emerald bracelets or sapphire necklaces, nor intricate Mary's lace and expensive satin gowns of House Baratheon could compete with Hariel. People were vying to be the runner-up here, which could obviously only be House Targaryen. And the sooner everyone accepted that, the sooner Aemond could return to his boiled levers and gambitson. The crown grant him wisdom, but why did he think it necessary to spend hours dressing as if for a ball simply for a regular Tuesday's supper? Aemond was sure Hariel's magic allowed her to get ready with a wave of her hand, and she'd still outshine the ladies and lords at court alike. He'd explained this, but even his mother was stressing over it, having spent hours getting ready simply to break her fast. Leave us, Aemond told the servants, who took their buckets and linen and did as instructed. I've been meaning to have a word with you, Aemond insisted, talking over her. Would you care to walk with me, Lady Hariel? Unlike Jacqueline, who would leap at the chance, or one of the Storm Four, who would blush and be delighted by his attention, Hariel hesitated. Enough time passed for him to grow uncomfortable under the inspection of her haunting green eyes, his hands becoming clammy. What if she said no? Here in public? Was she still so angry she wouldn't even use an excuse? Just as he'd almost convinced himself she'd say no, Hariel nodded. Where to, Prince Aemond? The sounds of more people coming down the stairs made Aemond lead Hariel back to the passage he'd arrived from, hoping to leave the wing entirely. I wasn't aware you'd be reading for father today. I would have liked to listen. You could ask the Grand Maester to see his notes. Your mother and Princess Rhaenyra were there as well. Of course father had remembered to invite Rhaenyra. What wasn't she included in these days? Not Helaena. She's with the Lannisters, doing needlework I believe. I'll have to reread the part she'd missed this evening. Thank you. Hariel frowned. It was Helaena who wished to learn of this. Yet you don't seem to enjoy the book much, while my sister very much does, Aemond said. Helaena had so few friends at court, as most were social climbers basking in Helena's royal station, smiling to her face but unnerved by her interests. Few accepted her differences as easily as Hariel did, or Rubius. It's not an inconvenience, Hariel said. I won't have to repeat much of it, because Princess Rhaenyra went into labor after only 7 pages and I had to stop. As if Rhaenyra had heard them, her voice rang out from above. Off! Off! Too fucking warm now! It sounds like she's still in labor, a girl said, but it wasn't Ariel. Rhaena, Bela and toddling little Visenya turned the corner at the other end of the hallway. As most ladies at court of late, they too were dressed in gowns and jewels as if heading to a feast. Oh, good afternoon, Prince Aemond, Rhaena said, brushing down her gown and with an uncertain smile added, Ariel? Good afternoon. Ariel was unexpectedly quiet and tightened her grip on the book in her arms without making eye contact with either of the twins. He knew they'd been arguing, but that was a change from the usual self-righteous tone from before. She almost looked guilty. Cousins, Aemond greeted the twins while overlooking Visenya hiding behind Rhaena's skirts, just as Lord Beesbury passed with a couple of guards. As Aemond silently bemoaned how fucking crowded the castle was getting, it only got worse. Nephews, Aemond acknowledged when Luke and Joffrey appeared by the corner as well. Joffrey had a play sword in hand and Luke a waster, but one could tell by their fine garments that he obviously hadn't done any true practicing. Have you been visiting Mother? Lucerys asked, bewildered. No, Aemond and Ariel answered with accidental synchronization. We're only passing through, Ariel added and addressed Luke. Go ahead, the maids upstairs will know better how your mother and the babe are faring than we do. I want a baby brother, Joffrey insisted, waving his toy. Looking down his nose at the dark-haired child, a smirk tugged on Aemond's lips. He was still hoping it'd be a girl, but even if it was a boy, that could be interesting too. A true-born son is a blessing to our father, Aemond said softly. Perhaps you'll get another brother, Joffrey, and perhaps this one will finally look like Sir Laenor. Jace, Luke and Joffrey were inheritance pilferers, and people could tell, but even House Velaryon would likely unite behind the true-born son of Sir Laenor the Unburned. Visenya Velaryon was but a girl, though with a son of his blood, would Sir Laenor still insist Jace, Luke and Joffrey were true-born? Would he allow House Velaryon's ancestral seed to pass through his wife's strong bastards instead? Would Corlys? Would there be a single Velaryon left to support a puppet like Luke if Laenor had a legitimate son with Velaryon features? His thoughts cut off when Rhaenyra's screech rang out again. I am breathing, you dried up cunt! The crude words in Havel's presence made it impossible not to think back to Winterfell, bringing up the ugliest of their arguments with a vengeance. You heard that, right? Aemond pointed demonstratively towards the ceiling, holding back the urge to exclaim, Are you going to be angry at her too now? Lucerys bristled and answered in her stead. It's only the midwife. My mother is in labor. Exactly, Bela said fiercely, feeling the need to noisy into their business too. The princess may express her pain however she deems fit. Were you not heading somewhere? Because we were. With a scowl, Aemond placed a hand on Ariel's back and applied just enough pressure to pull her along down the corridor, ignoring Rhaena, who, unlike her sister, seemed as if she might try to coerce Ariel away from him. The moment they were around the corner, he continued to interrupt with threat though. You see, she said it too, Aemond said pointedly under his breath, because if they heard the princess, there was a good chance the princess heard them too. That's not the same, she doesn't mean it. I never meant it either, Aemond insisted. Is that so? Could have fooled me. You were being difficult and I got angry and used some unfortunate words. It wasn't the only thing I didn't mean. Or do you actually think I meant to argue his suit? He said meaningfully, not even having to say the name for her to know whom he was referring to. I was making a point, but things just got out of hand. The last thing Aemond needed now was to run into Jace, Daemon, or the Seven Forbidds, Aegon. His brother would never let him live this down, and it was far too delicate a subject to discuss out in the open, so Aemond steered Ariel into a side chamber. Where are you taking us? Ariel asked, thinking at the dead end before Aemond revealed the hidden door to a secret passage. A shortcut. Aemond reached into his pocket and brought out a candle, lighting it on the nearest torch. To where exactly? More voices sounded from the hallway, and Aemond sighed. away from the parade of people marching around the East Wing. Taking it in stride, Ariel followed him into the dark passageway, but Aemond had only just closed the door before she spoke softly from behind him. Lumos. As if a wall had been torn, the passage was abruptly bathed in daylight. A little white sun shone from the tip of Ariel's magic stick, brightening the inside of the dust-covered passage in a way no man had seen since it was under construction. It stirred the creatures Aemond never would have noticed lived in the passage otherwise. He caught sight of a mouse scurrying away along the dirty floors, whilst layers of spiderwebs hung across the ceiling and walls. There was no reason to waste the wax now that Ariel had made his candle obsolete, and Aemond blew out his pathetic little flame. The passage could do with some cleaning. The dry remark caused a stirring of embarrassment in his chest. Why had he thought it would be a good idea to bring her to such a filthy place? How could the servants have missed this? It was unacceptable. There's never been so much light in here. Your magic has revealed sights hitherto concealed by the darkness. In consideration of your gown, do you wish to take the normal way, Ariel? The state of this is... Rest assured, I'll have a servant clean this promptly. Not at all, actually, Ariel said, bemused. It's a secret passage. I want to see where it goes. She was nearly as unfazed by the vermin as Helena would be, though with far less intrigue too, seeming more interested in the passage itself than the uninvited inhabitants. You do? He asked, several ideas springing to mind. There's many of these used by the servants or guards, he said conversationally, setting off down the corridor. If you want, I could show you the passages I've discovered so far, and there's probably more yet to be revealed. Aemond kept his voice low, knowing the walls were far better at blocking light than noise. Footsteps within the walls was how Aemond had discovered one of the passages a few years back. Why do you think so? You see, after the construction of the Red Keep finished in 50 ADC, King Maegor the Cruel held a feast for its builders, carvers and stonemasons. However, after 3 days of feasting, Maegor had all of the craftsmen killed so that only he would know the Red Keep's secrets. Oh, she grimaced. Was there an atrocity that man didn't commit? Aemond didn't have to think on it long. No. Usurper, sacrilegious, kin-killer, oppressor, Maegor had covered just about all the atrocities, hadn't he? And that was only the public records of his activities. Aemond knew well how much a prince could get erased, a king probably more so. And let's honor the memory of the builder who designed this passage instead, Ariel said. Whomever he may have been, his craftsmanship is noteworthy and continues to be used long after his untimely passing. Aemond rolled his eyes, but couldn't help but smile. Of all the things to take away from that tale, you note the efforts of the nameless peasants. Don't underestimate them. Even if songs or history don't remember their names, time remembers their actions. Had the builders done a worse job, this passage would have been less used, and history might have changed. What? Aemond laughed despite himself. How so? You see, before Hagrid and I came to Westeros, we first spent about a year in Essos. Yes, some fishing town, wasn't it? He parroted, lost to her line of thinking. How was this relevant? At the end there, we suddenly got attacked in the night. I know, by soldiers sent by some Loraf master with designs on Norbert. Yes, though it didn't work, because we were prepared. Ariel spoke over him. But only because of Jago. Jago. A perfectly common peasant, no more than a son of a fisherman. Another boy? And she sounded almost more fond of this Jago, a peasant, than she'd been speaking of Kraken. How so? Jago was my friend. He and his cousin Farah were the ones who taught me Valyrian when I first arrived in Essos, and kept helping me after their town rejected us as outsiders. Yet when Jago learned we were in danger, he ran through the forest for hours in the pitch darkness to warn Hagrid and I that Loraf soldiers were coming for Norbert. He's the reason we had time to pack and prepare. He might have saved our lives, Aemond, because I had gone to bed by the time he knocked on the door. I might have died, and if I had, then I'd never have come to Westeros. and I'd have never have been there when Vega tried burning you, so perhaps he saved you too. Then it's a shame he was nothing but a fisherman's son, Aemond allowed reluctantly. From your accounts of his actions, he would have suited knighthood better. There's no way Hariel missed his lackluster tone, yet she smiled brightly anyway, seeming happy he'd talk kindly about some far-off peasant whose greatest achievement was years behind him and no longer mattered. Next, Aemond's foot smashed hard into a piece of uneven floorboard he'd failed to step over, the jolts of pain making him hiss. Are you alright? It was just my toe, Aemond muttered. The passage might be usable, but clearly there was room for improvements. Those are only some finishing touches. Perhaps the builders would have gotten around to it if Maegor hadn't killed them. Hariel rolled her eyes and Aemond snickered. More often than not, he bemoaned Hariel's kindness and dreaded all the ways it could be taken advantage of. Though as Aemond glanced around the dirty passage, trying to conjure an image of a faceless peasant who'd spent years building it just right, only to be killed for completing his greatest achievement, a thought snuck up that made him wonder if her kind heart wasn't for the better. Because Maegor, with Hariel's kind of magic, the idea alone sent shivers down his spine. Where does that go? Hariel whispered, pointing to a low portion of the wall and breaking him out of his rapid trail of thoughts. They still had a ways left to go, so Aemond didn't understand what she meant before Hariel bent down and pushed aside a piece of the board, revealing a tunnel opening so low it was only accessible by crawling into the tunnel, and easily missed even with the exceptional amount of light from Hariel's magic. I'm unfamiliar with this one. Aemond bent down next to her, peering into the tunnel curiously. It had a bit of an angle and turned to the left further in. Catching her eye, Aemond could tell her thoughts were running alongside his own here. Want to find out? She dared him. This was not what Aemond meant to do today. Not how he wanted to waste his opportunity to actually speak with her. And then there were the more practical issues. But still, how could he say no? The tension would have loomed over them like a snow cloud since the north had briefly cleared up, and exploring with Hariel was far more tempting than arguing. Aemond was so sick of the arguing. We'll have to crawl, and it'll probably be in a worse condition than the passage. Our tires will be ruined. Hariel reached up and with a bit of tugging removed her hood and shawl piece, putting it unceremoniously into the pocket of her gown. She left the magical thread braided into her hair be. Against the backdrop of her raven hair it looked like a thread of stars. You're right. She eyed Aemond's attire speculatively. But I can probably magic away the worst once we're out again, for us both. Well then. I'd normally insist on ladies first, but in this case I'll have to make an exception. I have no idea where this goes or what's inside.